The knife hit the table between Tobias Morgan's fingers so fast he barely had time to flinch. He had been midway through a ballad about a river merchant's faithless wife, his lute propped against his knee, the common room of the crossroads packed shoulder to shoulder with drovers, merchants, and wandering sellswords, when the blade struck the wood with a sound like a cracked whip, and the room went silent as a held breath. Tobias looked up from the quivering knife and found a man standing over him. Big, red-faced, wearing a merchant's coat gone shabby at the elbows. His name was Aldrich Vane, and Tobias had heard of him before he ever walked through the Crossroads Inn's door. Everyone on the trade road between Brecken's Ford and the capital knew Aldrich Vane. They knew he moved goods that weren't entirely legal and settled debts with methods that weren't entirely human. "That ballad," Aldrich said very quietly, "has my wife's name in it." Tobias looked down at his lute strings. He looked at the knife. He looked back up at Aldrich. "The wife in the ballad," he said carefully, "is named Merritt. If your wife's name is also Merritt, I offer her my sincere condolences on her choice of husband." The room did not laugh. It was that kind of room at that kind of moment, and Tobias had always had more courage than sense. Aldrich's hand closed around the front of Tobias's coat, hauling him halfway off his stool. "I have men outside this inn who will put you in the river before morning," Aldrich said. "You understand me. Your kind always dies face down in the reeds. Clever little bards, clever little liars. Nobody misses them." Tobias opened his mouth, though he had no idea what he was going to say. He never found out, because the hand on his coat was suddenly gone, replaced by a different pressure, entirely a massive green hand, wrapped around Aldrich's wrist with the casual, absolute authority of a closing bear trap. "Let him go," said a woman's voice. Low, measured, with an accent like stones settling in deep water. Aldrich let go of Tobias. He had no real choice. The woman holding his wrist was an orc, and she was not small. She stood a full head taller than Aldrich, broad through the shoulder, with the kind of controlled stillness that in the wild means apex predator. Her skin was a deep forest green, her tusks short and elegant, more curved than jutting, framing a full mouth that at this moment was pressed into a flat, unimpressed line. She wore fitted warrior's leathers, a dark reddish-brown that set off her coloring, a laced bodice cinched at the waist over a long-sleeved undertunic, supple trousers tucked into heavy boots, a short cloak pinned at one shoulder with an iron brooch shaped like a bear's paw. At her hip she wore no sword but a long-handled fighting axe, and she wore it with the ease of a man wearing a belt. Her eyes, when they settled on Aldrich, were amber, the color of old honey, the color of fire through a bottle. "You're going to leave," she said to Aldrich, "and you're going to take your men from outside, and tomorrow morning you are going to remember this as the night you were wise enough to walk away." Aldrich stared at her for a long, brittle moment. Then he wrenched his wrist back. She let him have it, which was worse than if she'd held on, and walked out of the Crossroads Inn without another word. The door banged shut behind him. The room breathed again. Someone in the corner began talking loudly about grain prices, because that is what people do when they have just witnessed something they cannot quite process. Tobias sat on his stool with his lute in his lap and looked up at the orc woman. "Thank you," he said. She retrieved her knife from the table between his fingers. She had thrown it there herself, he realized now, as a distraction, and sheathed it at her thigh without looking at him. "Finish the ballad," she said. "You stopped at the best part." She went back to the corner where she had apparently been sitting before, alone, with a cup of something dark and a plate of food she'd barely touched. Tobias watched her go, then picked up his lute and finished the ballad from memory, though his hands were still unsteady enough that he flubbed 3 chords. He learned her name that same night later, when the crowd had thinned and the fire in the great hearth had settled into orange coals. He had been making his rounds, he called them, the slow circuit of the room, collecting a coin here, a shared drink there, a muttered request for a song someone hadn't heard since their mother sang it, and he found himself at the corner table almost without intending to. She was still there. She had a small whetstone out and was running it along the edge of the axe blade in slow, meditative strokes. She did not look up when he pulled out the chair across from her. "I was going to buy you a drink," he said, "but I suspect you tell me to keep my money." "Keep your money," she said. "Sit down anyway." He sat. He ordered 2 cups of the inn's better wine from the passing server, the one that didn't taste like vinegar thinned with river water, and put one in front of her without comment. She looked at it. She picked it up and drank. Her name was Ursa Ironblood. She said it the way most people say their names in front of strangers they don't trust, yet straight, flat, with no invitation behind it. But she didn't refuse to give it, which he took as a decent sign. "Ironblood," he repeated. "Clan name." "Battle name? My clan name is not for strangers." "Fair enough." He held out his hand across the table. "Tobias Morgan." "I don't have a battle name because no one's given me anything impressive enough to fight for yet." She looked at his hand for a moment, then she shook it. Her grip could have cracked walnuts, and she was clearly being careful not to. "You play well," she said, "for a man who talks too much." "I play better than I talk," he agreed. "My mother always said the same thing. What brings you to the crossroads?" "Same as everyone else on the trade road," she said. "I'm moving north." "Heard there's work in Brecken's Ford." She paused, running the whetstone in one more long stroke. "What brings a bard to a place like this?" "Same as everyone else," he said, "minus the work in Brecken's Ford. I go where people will listen. The crossroads gets every kind of person on the continent. I collect stories here. Songs, secrets, troubles." He looked at his wine cup. "I collected a pretty significant enemy tonight, apparently. Aldrich Vane." She said the name without any particular inflection, as if reading it off a wall. "I know of him. Everyone on the road knows of him." "Then you were foolish to bait him." "I was," he agreed. "It was a good line, though." For the first time, something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The precursor to one, maybe the decision being weighed. "The wife's condolences," she said. "You heard that?" "I was sitting 12 feet away." "Right." He felt heat climb his neck. "Was it a good line or a stupid line?" "Both," she said. "That's usually how it goes." He made her laugh properly twice that night. The first time, midway through a story about a duel he had witnessed in the city of Gallows Rest between 2 men over a single horse, and the horse's reaction to the outcome, and she laughed low and sudden, as if she hadn't planned to. The second time, he did not even know what he had said. He had been talking about learning to play the lute from a half-deaf fisherman on the coast, and something in the telling caught her off guard, and she laughed again, longer this time, and then pressed her lips together as if she were slightly annoyed at herself for doing it. He filed both instances away. He was, at his core, a man who collected things. They parted ways at the end of the night, when the last server started dousing the candles, and the fire was down to its final glow. She headed upstairs to whatever room she'd taken, and he gathered his loot and his coin purse, and went to the room he'd paid for with tonight's earnings, a narrow, drafty little space at the back of the inn that shared a thin wall with the stable. He lay on the rough blanket and stared at the ceiling and thought about Aldrich Vane's face, and the knife hitting the table and amber eyes in firelight. In the morning, he found that Aldrich Vane's men, 4 of them, it turned out, not the vague multitude Aldrich had implied, had been waiting in the stable. They had searched his saddlebag, which contained nothing of interest since Tobias owned no horse and therefore had no saddlebag. They had overturned a cart in the yard, presumably out of frustration, and scratched the words "Dead Bard" into the wall of the inn's outer fence. The innkeeper, a round woman named Dory who had seen approximately everything in her decades running the crossroads, pointed at the scratched words and looked at Tobias with the expression of someone who is calculating how much damage she expects from a particular guest. "You know what that means," she said. "I do," Tobias said. "Vane's not a man who forgets." "No," Tobias said, "I gathered that. You planning on running north?" He considered it. "Not immediately," he said. He had a reason to stay, though he would not have phrased it that way if anyone had asked him. He would have said the inn was warm and the audience was good, and he needed another week to gather material. He would not have said the reason was a green-skinned woman with amber eyes who had laughed twice at his stories, and had not looked at him the way most people looked at him, as a source of entertainment, or a minor nuisance, or a curiosity, but as if she were reading him slowly, the way you read something in a language you are still learning. She was at breakfast when he came downstairs. She was eating alone at the same corner table, steadily, with the focused efficiency of someone who treats food as fuel rather than pleasure. He brought his own plate and sat across from her without asking permission, because he had done it once and she hadn't told him not to. "They vandalized the fence," he said. "Vane's men." She did not look up from her food. "I know, I saw them." "You saw them?" "I woke early." She looked up then. "I was watching from the stable loft. There were 4 of them. They were looking for you." She paused. "They didn't find you." "I wasn't in the stable." "I know, that's why they didn't find you." A very small shift in her expression again. "They'll come back." "Probably," he agreed. He ate a piece of bread. "You didn't have to stay to watch." "I wasn't staying for you," she said. "I was staying because I woke early and had nothing better to do." It was such an obvious half-truth that he almost called her on it, but he had enough self-preservation instinct barely to understand the difference between a challenge she would appreciate and one she would simply not forgive. He let it go. "Are you truly going north?" he asked. "To Brecken's Ford." "That's what I said." "I'm going north too," he said. "Eventually. There's a festival there in 6 weeks, the Autumn Trading Fair. They pay a bard well who can fill the main hall." He looked at his bread. "The road north is safer in company." She studied him for a long moment. He was aware of how he must look from where she sat. Middling height, lean in the way people are when they've been eating irregularly for years rather than training, with brown hair that was slightly too long and a face that was pleasant without being remarkable. He had been told he had good eyes, dark, attentive, and a good voice. He was 28 years old and had no home and owned a lute, a good coat, and a knife he barely knew how to use. She was probably 24 or 25, he estimated, and could have broken him across her knee without particular effort. "I travel alone," she said. "So do I," he said. "Usually by preference, but Vane has men on the North Road, and he stopped. He was going to say he could offer her something in return, and he was trying to figure out what that was precisely. Music on the road, entertainment. He did not think Ursa Ironblood was particularly starved for entertainment. "I can be useful," he said finally. "I know people on the road, innkeepers, tollmen. I can get us through doors that might be closed otherwise." She looked at him steadily. "And in return you want protection on the road." "In return I'd be grateful, which I am already from last night." The silence stretched out long enough that he thought she was going to say no. Then she pushed back from the table and stood, pulling on her short cloak with a practiced shrug. "We leave after midday," she said. "Be ready." That was how it began. The North Road out of Crossroads stretched through 20 miles of open farmland before it hit the first of the hill country, and they covered most of the flat stretch on the first afternoon in something that was not quite comfortable silence and not quite conversation, a middle ground of occasional, blunt exchanges that Tobias suspected was as much warmth as she offered most people on short acquaintance. He learned small things. She walked with her weight forward, always slightly ahead of him, which he understood after an hour was not rudeness but positioning. She was putting herself between him and anything that might come off the tree line to the right. She carried a water skin she never offered to share but refilled at every stream without comment. She watched the hills the way he watched audiences, for the small signals, the things people didn't know they were broadcasting. He played no music on the road that first day. It didn't seem right. Instead, he talked cautiously in the way he'd learned to talk to people who weren't sure yet whether they liked him, not performing, not trying to be entertaining, just putting words in the air between them and seeing which ones she picked up. "How long have you been on the road?" he asked when they stopped to let their feet rest at a stream crossing. "Years," she said, "since I left my clan." "You left voluntarily?" A pause. "Yes." He didn't push it. He could hear the thing behind the word, the compressed weight of it, and he was a good enough storyteller to know when a story wasn't ready to be told yet. "I left the coast at 22, he offered instead. "My teacher, the fisherman I mentioned, died. The fishing village had nothing for me after that. I've been playing at the market there since I was 16, but it's not the same, playing for people who have heard every song you know. He looked at the stream. I wanted to go somewhere new, hear new things, turn them into songs. You're still turning things into songs, she asked. Always, he said. You, for instance. He glanced at her sideways. I'm going to have to be very careful how I describe the knife, though. Vane will assume any ballad with a knife in it is about him. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, make the knife describe a circle before it hits. His men couldn't throw a circle if their lives depended on it. He stared at her. He stopped. That's actually a useful detail for identifying the thrower. Yes, she said, and there was satisfaction in it. You planned that, he said slowly. You threw the knife as a signature, as proof of presence. Anyone who knows Ironblood throwing style will know I was in that room, she said. Vane has enough enemies. He'll spend time wondering which of them I'm working for before he settles on harassing a bard. Tobias sat with that for a moment. That's extremely clever, he said. Yes, she said again, and this time she allowed herself a fraction more than just the flicker of a smile. They camped that night off the road, in a hollow between two old beeches where the roots made a natural windbreak. Ursa built the fire with 3 movements that produced reliable flame from damp wood, which Tobias could not have done in 30. He contributed the food, dried meat, and hard cheese he'd restocked at the inn, and the act of dividing it and laying it out on the flat stone between them felt, in some quiet way, like an agreement. They ate. The fire settled. The night came down around them with its usual assortment of sounds: wind in the upper branches, something moving through leaves at a respectful distance, the occasional bark of a fox far off in the farmland. Ursa sat across the fire from him, her axe laid across her knees, not because she expected trouble but because that was simply where she kept it. She was looking into the fire, not at him, and there was something in her stillness that was different from how she'd been all day, less braced somehow, less deliberate. She said without preamble, I have decided you are interesting. Tobias looked up from the stick he'd been using to nudge a coal back into the fire. I'm sorry. You. She met his eyes. Amber in firelight, the color of the coals themselves. I have decided you are interesting. I thought you should know. He sat with this for a moment. Outside, the fox barked again. Inside the hollow, the fire crackled, and Tobias Morgan, who had made his life out of words, who could spin a 2-hour story from a single overheard argument, who had talked his way out of debts and into dinners, and through locked doors found that he had nothing immediate to say. What does that mean? He asked finally. When you say it like that. She tilted her head slightly. My people have a word. It does not translate exactly. The closest in your language would be something like worth attending to. Worth the time of watching. A pause. Most people are not. They are predictable. They do what the shape of them suggests they will do, and there is no surprise. She looked back at the fire. You are not the shape of what you do. That is unusual. He turned this over in his mind. He was aware that it was a significant statement, more significant, probably, than it would be if a human woman said something similar, but he wasn't sure of all the edges of it yet, and he was self-aware enough to know that he did not want to get the response wrong. I could say the same of you, he said. You could, she agreed, but I did not ask. I know. He looked at her across the fire. What do you want me to say to it? Nothing specific, she said. I wanted you to know, that is all. He nodded slowly, turning the stick in his hands. Then I'm glad you told me, he said, genuinely. I'm not. He stopped and then pushed through the hesitation because she deserved the honest thing. I'm not someone people tend to find interesting. Entertaining, yes, useful sometimes, but interesting. He shook his head. That's different. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, it is. They did not say anything else about it that night, but something had shifted in the air between them, something that had been considering its options and had now made a quiet, tentative choice to move forward. In the morning, she poured water from her skin into both their cups without asking, and he understood that as the thing it was. The hill country began on the 3rd day, and with the hills came the first real trouble. They were navigating a section of road that cut through a long, exposed ridge, the kind of place where travelers were visible for a mile in either direction, which was either safety or disaster depending on who was watching, when Tobias heard the sound. He was no woodsman, but he had spent enough nights on bad roads to know the difference between wildlife moving through underbrush and something heavier, pacing them. He said nothing. He glanced at Ursa. She was already watching the tree line on the left. Her hand had dropped to the head of her axe with the absolute naturalness of someone who has done this so often it requires no thought. 3, she said quietly. Maybe 4. They've been with us since the stream crossing. Vane's men could be scouts, could be opportunists who saw an orc and a slight man and thought easy marks. Tobias resisted the urge to be offended by the characterization of himself and focused instead on the practical question. What do we do? Keep walking. Same pace. Don't look at the tree line again. She moved very slightly to his left, putting herself between him and the trees without making it obvious. And stop gripping your knife like you've never held one before. You'll need both hands free. He forced his right hand open. What am I doing with my hands? Reach into your coat as if you're getting something out. Do it slowly. He did. There's nothing in my inner pocket. They don't know that. Her voice was perfectly level. You are now, in their eyes, a man comfortable enough with weapons that he carries something additional in his coat. That changes the calculation. The footsteps in the trees were getting closer. He could hear them now clearly enough to count 3 at least, maybe a 4th hanging back. Too many for him to be any real use, and he knew it. He was not going to pretend otherwise. If this goes badly, he said very quietly, I can probably distract at least one of them. With what? My voice, I'm told it carries. She glanced at him sidelong. Stay behind me, stay to my right. Do not try to be a hero. There's a significant difference between brave and pointlessly dead. I've been told that too, he said. My mother, also the half-deaf fisherman. The attack came from the left tree line, as they rounded the curve of the ridge, 2 men breaking from the brush at a run, with a third coming down from the rocks above and to the right. They had wooden clubs and a short crossbow, and they were dressed in the kind of mismatched travel-worn gear that said hired rather than desperate. Vane's men, or Vane's men's friends, the message from the fence repeated in human form. Ursa moved. He had seen her still, and he had seen her walking, and he had seen her calm, and none of that had quite prepared him for what happened when she decided to move quickly. She was between him and the first 2 men before he had registered her stepping, the axe in her hand spinning up from its rest, with a motion that was almost casual. She didn't swing it. She planted herself in the path of the first man and simply stopped, and the man couldn't quite change direction in time, and the haft of the axe caught him across the upper chest with a crack that dropped him to one knee. The second man pulled up short. The third, coming from above, had the crossbow. Down, Ursa said, flat and calm. Tobias dropped. The bolt passed overhead. He heard her short, sharp sound of movement, a scramble of boots on rock, a heavy impact, and then silence. He looked up. The first man was sitting in the road looking confused and winded. The second was running, already 20 yards back the way they'd come. The third was on his back in the brush at the edge of the road with the crossbow 3 feet from his hand and Ursa's boot between his shoulder blades. Message, she said to the man under her boot. When you see Aldrich Vane, you tell him Ursa Ironblood has put herself on this road. Do you understand that? The man made a sound that was probably yes. Say it back to me. He said it back, voice cracking. She stepped off him. He scrambled upright and was gone into the brush at a pace that suggested he had reevaluated his life's choices entirely. The first man was still sitting in the road. Ursa looked at him. He got up and walked away very quickly without looking at either of them. Tobias stood and brushed himself off. His heart was going at roughly twice its normal pace, but his hands were steady, which surprised him. Ironblood, he said. Is that your battle name or your family name? Battle name, she sheathed the axe. My family name is for people I trust. And I'm interesting but not trusted. She looked at him, and this time the precursor to a smile became the actual thing, brief, sharp, completely genuine. Not yet, she said. She started walking again. He fell into step beside her, slightly to her right, as she'd positioned him. For what it's worth, he said after a moment, You have just become the subject of at least one very good ballad. Aim it after someone else, she said. I prefer not to be famous until I choose to be. They made better time through the hill country after that, because the word had apparently gotten ahead of them, or else three of Vane's scouts had found other things to do, and the road was quiet. On the fifth night, they camped in the shelter of an old way station, a crumbling stone structure that smelled of previous travelers and damp earth, with a fire ring in the center and enough of the roof remaining to keep out the wind. Over the fire, with food between them that had graduated from hard cheese to actual bread and dried fruit from a farmstead where Tobias had played 3 songs in exchange for hospitality, Ursa talked about her clan. Not everything. Not all at once. She was not a woman who gave things away in bulk, but in pieces over the course of the evening, as the fire burned down and the wind pushed at the open walls of the way station. She had left the Ironblood clan 3 years ago, after her mother died. Her mother had been the war boss, the head of clan, the voice of decision, and when she died, the clan had chosen Ursa's uncle, who was a harder man and a smaller thinker, and who believed that the right response to the treaty between the orc clans and the human kingdoms was to reject it and return to raiding. And you disagreed, Tobias said. I disagreed, she said. Loudly and then repeatedly, and then with a great deal of damage to the training yard when my uncle told me the clan did not need the counsel of a woman who hadn't won a blood war. What's a blood war? A contest of leadership. You challenge the current leader and you fight until one of you yields. She looked at her hands. I could have won it. My uncle knew that. He called me a traitor's daughter, which was a way of saying my mother was weak for making the treaty. A pause. I left that night. It seemed the better choice than spending the rest of my life proving I was right by destroying people I had grown up with. Tobias was quiet for a moment. He understood, with the clarity that sometimes came from listening to people, the particular note of someone who had made a decision that was both right and devastating, and who had not stopped carrying it. That was a brave thing, he said. Harder than winning the fight would have been. She looked at him across the fire. Not the considering look from before, something more direct. You believe that? Yes, he said. The fights that cost you people you love are always harder than the ones that just cost you blood. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away at the fire. You speak of it as if you know. I do, he said, differently, less dramatically, but yes. The silence that followed was a comfortable one, the first genuinely comfortable silence between them since they'd started traveling together. He thought about playing something, but the moment seemed to not want music. It wanted to be left alone. He was wrong that Ursa Ironblood did not want company, he realized. She was simply exquisitely careful about which company she kept. She had been alone so long that she had built efficiency where warmth used to be, because warmth requires trust and trust had let her down. She was not cold. She was meticulous. He found that he respected that more than he could easily say. They arrived at the town of Millhaven on the 7th day, a market town, where the North Road crossed the River Brace on a stone bridge old enough to have been there before the town was. Millhaven was the kind of place that had everything a traveler needed, and welcomed them only in the strictly economic sense. There was a market square, 3 inns, a garrison of the King's Road, wardens, and a population of about 2,000 who had strong opinions about propriety and very little tolerance for anything that disrupted the orderly flow of commerce. Tobias had been to Millhaven twice before. He knew the largest in the Brace, and barley paid well for a good musician at the weekly market night, and he had been intending to stop here anyway. He had not quite worked out how to explain Ursa's presence, because in Millhaven, as in many of the market towns on the North Road, orcs were not exactly welcomed. Permitted, technically, because the treaty required it. But the kind of permitted that came with narrowed eyes and pointed silences and the occasional idiot who decided to make a scene. He was thinking about this as they crossed the bridge into town, and then the scene made itself without his assistance. There were perhaps 40 people in the market square, in the middle of an ordinary morning, traders at their stalls, housewives with baskets, a couple of road wardens leaning against a wall. When Ursa walked into the square beside Tobias, the quality of the noise changed. It didn't stop exactly. It thinned. Conversations became quieter, sharper-edged, pointed in their direction. He felt Ursa go very still beside him. A man separated from the crowd near the well. He was dressed in a merchant's colors, fat rings on his fingers, the kind of face that was born convinced of its own authority. He came toward them with the particular walk of someone who has decided he is representing community standards. "Orc," he said, stopping a few feet away. "You'll want to state your business before you go further in." Ursa looked at him. "I'll state my business at the inn where I am going." "Orcs don't stay at the Brace and Barley. Innkeeper's policy." "Then the innkeeper can tell me so herself," Ursa said. "I'm telling you," the man said. His voice had risen enough to pull more people into attention range. "You people are allowed on the road, allowed through the gate. You're not welcome here in this square, making decent folk uncomfortable." Tobias had been watching the crowd and watching Ursa, and he could see two things simultaneously: that she was not going to back down, not because she was aggressive, but because she had stopped backing down years ago and the decision was built into her now, and that the crowd was tipping in the direction of something worse than words. He stepped forward. He placed himself slightly in front and to the side, not between them exactly, but enough to reposition the scene. He used his voice the way he used it in halls where the audience was losing interest, pitched to carry, shaped to make people look. "Excuse me," he said, loudly and clearly. "I wonder if someone can help me. I'm looking for the road warden's post." He looked around with the expression of a man who is genuinely seeking assistance, and most of the crowd, by pure social reflex, looked where he was looking. "I have a matter to report to the garrison. A contract matter, actually, regarding a blood price." The merchant blinked. "What? A blood price?" Tobias repeated. He looked at the merchant with what he hoped was the expression of a man entirely calm and completely in command of information. "Filed under the name Aldrich Vane. My companion and I are witnesses to an attempted execution on the King's Road, which is, I believe, a garrison matter." He paused. "Unless you prefer we report it elsewhere, I can work with either. I'm flexible. But if it's all the same to you, I'd like to get it sorted before evening because I'm playing the market night and I need time to tune." The merchant stared at him. The crowd shifted, recalculating. Road warden matters were official matters. Nobody wanted to be in the way of official matters, because official matters had a way of expanding to include bystanders. The merchant said nothing. He stepped back. And then, blessedly, he walked away and the crowd went back to its business, and Tobias turned to Ursa and found her watching him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. "You made that up," she said quietly. "The blood price is real enough," he said. "The idea of filing it with the garrison is extremely improvised. But it worked. Words usually do," he said, "if you use them before someone decides action is necessary." He tilted his head toward the Brace and Barley. "Shall we see if the innkeeper's policy is actually what that man said it was?" It was not, as it turned out. The innkeeper of the Brace and Barley was a lean, dry woman named Cass who looked at Ursa with the expression of someone doing quick arithmetic. Then she looked at Tobias. "You're the bard who played the Autumn Fair 2 years running?" she asked. "3, actually," he said. "You play market night tomorrow." "I do." "Then your companion can have the room next to yours," she said, "and anyone who objects can sleep in the yard." She held out her hand for the coin. "Payment in advance." Tobias paid. He could feel Ursa's eyes on the side of his face as he did it. When Cass had moved off, Ursa said quietly, "I could have paid for my own room." "I know," he said. "Consider it what I owe you for the knife trick and the ridge." A pause. "We're even now then," she said. "If you like," he said. She didn't say anything more, but when they went upstairs, she knocked on the wall between their rooms, 2 knocks, nothing else, and he understood that as the orc equivalent of good night. He played market night in the Brace and Barley's great room to a packed house, because 3 years of returning to a town will build you a following even in a town that isn't naturally warm toward performers. He played for 2.5 hours ballads, a couple of comic songs, a long instrumental piece that the older traders liked because it reminded them of the city. And he played well, the kind of well that only happened when something in the ambient circumstances had made him feel, against all practical evidence, as if things were going to be all right. Ursa sat at the bar for the whole of it. She had taken one of the high stools with her back to the shelves of bottles and her face toward the room, which meant she was watching both him and everyone watching him. She had a cup of the inn's decent ale. She listened. She was the only person in the room who listened to every single song from beginning to end, without fidgeting, without talking, without looking away. He was aware of her attention the entire time. It was different from an audience's attention. It was not the appreciation of a crowd, which was warm and generic and a little blurring, like standing near a fire. It was specific. It was directed. It was the attention of someone who had decided something was worth attending to and was following through. He went to her afterward, while the room was still loud with the aftermath of music and wine. She pushed a cup of ale toward him without being asked. "You played the Old Coast song," she said. "The one about the fisherman. You recognized it. I've traveled widely," she said. "I heard a version of it years ago from an old woman in a harbor town." She was quiet for a moment. It was her song. She used to sing it for her husband who was at sea. "It's an old song," Tobias said. "I learned it from my fisherman teacher. He said it was older than the coast." She nodded slowly, turning her cup in her hands. "You play it differently than she did, but the core of it is the same." A pause. "It is a good song." "High praise," he said. "I don't offer low praise," she said. "There's no point in saying a thing is good when you mean merely acceptable." He looked at her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the elegant curve of her tusks catching the lamplight, the way she held herself at rest, still, alert, not performing ease but genuinely experiencing something close to it. She was, he thought, one of the most singular people he had ever met, and he had met a great many. "Ursa," he said. She turned to look at him. "I told you I collect stories," he said. "The truth is, I don't just collect them. I look for the ones worth keeping. The ones that matter." He held her gaze. "I think yours is one of them." She studied him for a long moment. "Are you saying that because you want a song or because you mean it?" "Both," he said. "But mostly because I mean it." She looked back at her cup. "That is the most honest thing I have decided to believe from you yet," she said. It was not a declaration. But from Ursa Ironblood it was approximately the same thing. In the morning something went badly wrong. Tobias woke to shouting in the market square below his window, not the ordinary market noise, but the sharp, elevated sound of a crowd that has found a cause. He went to the window in his shirt and looked out. In the center of the square, there was a rope. It was strung between the two posts that flanked the square's central well, the same posts they tied livestock to on market day, and beneath it stood Ursa Ironblood, her hands bound behind her back with heavy rope, her axe gone, her eyes going from flat to incandescent as he watched. Around her was a crowd of perhaps 60 people, and in front of the crowd, holding what appeared to be a written document, was the merchant from yesterday. He had acquired the company of 3 road wardens and someone in the dark coat of a magistrate's deputy, and he was reading from the document in a carrying voice. Tobias was moving before the words fully resolved themselves. He hit the stairs at a dead run, pushed through the ground floor. Cass caught his arm at the door, her face tight. "Don't go out there like that," she said sharply. "What's happening?" he demanded. "That fool Grenner the merchant, the one from yesterday, he went to the garrison last night, filed a complaint under the Blood Compact laws. Says the orc attacked a citizen yesterday, that she threatened him in the square." Cass's eyes were sharp and worried. "Under the Blood Compact, an unprovoked orc attack on a human, she didn't attack him," Tobias said, "can be met with immediate sanction. Summary: the deputy has the authority." Cass looked at him hard. "They're planning to hang her, Morgan. Right now, before noon." The world went very still and very clear in the way it did sometimes before a crisis resolved into action. He went out. The square was loud with the sound of 60 people who had mostly not asked for this morning's entertainment but had now decided they had opinions. Tobias moved through them with his elbows out, not rough, but relentlessly, until he was at the front of the crowd with 15 feet of open square between him and Ursa and the deputy. She saw him. Her jaw set. She shook her head, a single sharp motion, the clearest possible communication of "don't." He ignored it. "Deputy," he said loudly. His voice cut across the crowd noise because he had spent 12 years learning how to make a voice cut across crowd noise. "I want to speak." The deputy, a thin man with a gray beard and the weary eyes of a bureaucrat who had expected a quiet posting, looked at him. "This is a matter of law," the deputy said. "It's not open for public comment." "It's open for testimony," Tobias said. "I was here. I'm a witness." The Blood Compact laws require witness testimony to be heard before sanction is carried out. Article 11. If you've done this before, you know it. A pause. He did not, in fact, know that Article 11 said any such thing. He did know that the Blood Compact laws were old, complicated, and sufficiently arcane that very few people were confident in their complete knowledge of them, including presumably the deputy who was wielding them. The deputy was frowning. "Your name?" "Tobias Morgan," he said. "Musician and registered storyteller, which under the trade charter gives me the right of public record. Also improvised almost completely. I am a material witness to the events in this square yesterday, and I am telling you that no attack occurred. There was a confrontation. My companion spoke." The citizen, he used the word with just enough emphasis to make several people near him hear what it implied, left of his own accord, unharmed. "The citizen says otherwise," said the merchant Grenner. "The citizen is mistaken," Tobias said. "Or lying. And I would suggest that before a rope is used in this square, you determine which one, because a wrongful hanging under the Blood Compact has consequences for every official present." He looked directly at the deputy. "Significant ones." The deputy's eyes had moved from the warrant to Tobias to Ursa to the crowd. He was doing the calculation that officials in uncertain situations always did. What will cause me the least trouble? A crowd that has been told this was a straightforward punishment was now hearing that it was possibly complicated. Crowds don't like complicated. Complicated smells like paperwork, like inquiry, like later consequences. "The bard is correct," said a new voice. Everyone looked. At the edge of the square, just arrived, were 4 people in the King's Road Warden blue, senior blue, not the garrison green of the Millhaven post, but the travel-worn blue of people who had come from further than here. One of them, a square-faced woman with sergeant's marks on her collar, was holding up a badge. "Regional Compact Authority," the sergeant said, walking forward. "Deputy, I'm going to need you to step back from this situation while I review the complaint." The crowd was very, very quiet. "This man," Grenner started, "is not currently speaking," the sergeant said without looking at him. She walked up to the deputy and took the warrant from his hand with the efficiency of someone who had seen this particular abuse of procedure before. She read it for 30 seconds. Then she looked at the merchant. "You filed a Blood Compact assault complaint," she said. "Against an orc who according to this said words to you and then walked away." She threatened. "The Blood Compact requires physical contact." The sergeant folded the warrant. "This is not an assault complaint. This is harassment. Do you understand the distinction?" She looked at the road warden standing with Grenner. "Cut her loose. Now." Tobias's legs were, he realized, not entirely steady. He was keeping them that way through an act of will and the fact that he was currently the center of approximately 60 people's attention, and he had enough professional vanity to refuse to visibly buckle. When Ursa's hands came free, she did not rub her wrists or adjust her posture, or do anything that would read as discomposure. She simply stood up straight. She was already straight and looked at the sergeant with the measured gravity of a woman who has just decided whether to make someone an ally or a neutral party. "Thank you," she said to the sergeant. "You'll want to lodge a counter-complaint," the sergeant said. "Against that one." She indicated Grenner. "I'll consider it," Ursa said. She collected her axe, which one of the road wardens brought over from where it had been laid on the ground, and walked across the square to Tobias. The crowd parted around her. The sound of 60 people trying to look as if they had not just been participants in an attempted execution was complicated and slightly comic. She stopped in front of him. He could see now that she was close that she was furious. Not at him, not at the situation exactly, but the deep, structural fury of a person who has experienced the same injustice enough times that each repetition hits an old bruise. Her jaw was set hard. Her amber eyes were incandescent. He said nothing. He simply stood there and looked at her, and what he was feeling must have been visible in his face because she looked at him for a long moment before she said, very quietly, "You could have gotten yourself killed." "I could have," he said. "I didn't think about it much." "You should have." "Probably," he agreed. "I had to think fast." She looked at him for another beat. Then she said with absolute precision, "The thing you said about Article 11, was that real?" "No," a long exhale, not quite a laugh, something close. "You are," she said, "extraordinary." "Interesting," he said, "was the word you used." She looked at him and the fury in her eyes was still there, but underneath it, or alongside it, was something else. Something warmer and more complicated, like a fire that has been burning quietly in a sheltered place for a while. "Both," she said, and she turned toward the inn. He followed her because there was nothing else he wanted to do. They stayed in Millhaven 2 more days, not entirely by choice. The regional compact sergeant, whose name was Hadley, asked them to remain for the formal inquiry into Grenner's complaint, which was brief and decisive, and ended with Grenner paying a fine, and a formal note entered in the regional record. Sergeant Hadley also, in passing, mentioned that Aldrich Vane was currently the subject of a separate inquiry in the capital, and that the road wardens had been looking for reliable witnesses to his activities on the North Road. Tobias and Ursa spent an afternoon with Hadley and 2 scribes, giving their accounts. Ursa described the men on the ridge with the calm efficiency of a report that had been filed many times, precise details, no embellishment, no emotion. Tobias described everything with the storyteller's instinct for what would land, and when he looked at Sergeant Hadley's face as he talked, he could see her building a picture. "You'll want to be careful," Hadley told them afterward. "Vane doesn't forget." "We know," Tobias said. "He'll have more men on the road north. Probably waiting at Fenmark Crossing. It's a natural bottleneck." She looked at Ursa. "If you're going to Brecken's Ford, you'll need to get through Fenmark." Ursa's expression was entirely calm. "We'll get through." Hadley looked at her, then at Tobias, then back at Ursa with the look of someone who has just updated an assessment. "I believe you will," she said. On the second evening in Millhaven, Tobias sat on the low wall of the inside garden, a private enough space at dusk, with the last of the autumn color on the vine growing up the stone, and played for no one in particular. Just for himself, the way he used to play on the coast, watching the ocean. He heard Ursa's boots on the cobblestones before she sat beside him. She sat close enough that her shoulder was 4 inches from his, which was closer than she had previously placed herself when sitting near him. He was aware of it in the way you are aware of warmth when you've been cold. He kept playing. She didn't speak for a while. The garden smelled of late herbs and turned earth, and the particular autumn dusk smell that had no name but that he associated with the end of long days. "What are you playing?" she asked. "Nothing with a name," he said. "It's not finished yet." "What is it going to be?" He glanced at her. "I don't know yet. I usually don't know until the end." She leaned back slightly, her palms flat on the wall behind her. "Is it about something?" "It's about—" He stopped, because the honest answer was that it had started out being about the night on the ridge and had become something else without his decision, about a fire in a hollow between 2 beeches and amber eyes, and the sensation of being looked at as if you were something genuinely worth looking at. He thought about whether to say that. He kept playing instead and let the music say it. She listened. She heard it. He could tell by the way her breathing changed and by the quality of her stillness, which went from alert to something closer to moved. She said nothing for a long time after he let the last note fade. Then she said, "That is going to be a very good song." "It might be," he said. "It's about—" She stopped. "Yes," he said, a long silence. The stars were coming out over the garden wall, the first ones, the bright leading edge. "I don't know what to do with you," she said finally, not in frustration, in the tone of someone making an honest statement of a genuine puzzle. He set the lute carefully across his lap. "What are the options?" She turned her head to look at him, and she was close enough that the turn brought her face near. Her eyes in the falling dark were very warm. "In my culture," she said slowly, "when someone decides another person is worth attending to, truly, formally decides, there are certain things that follow." "Like what?" "A declaration," she said, "made clearly so there is no room for misunderstanding." She held his gaze. "I declared it at the fire. You asked what it meant." "I did," he said, "and you told me, worth watching, worth the time of attention." "Yes," a pause. "But that is the beginning of the thing, not the end of it." She looked away at the stars. "The next part of the thing, in my culture, is that the person who is declared interesting may ask what is being offered. And the person who declared it must say so clearly, without a slight hesitation, which from her was significant, without evasion." "And what is being offered?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that the night settled another degree into itself, and the vine rustled in a breath of wind, and a door somewhere in the inn opened and closed. "My attention," she said, "which I do not give easily or lightly, my company for as long as company is wanted, my protection which I give entirely or not at all." She paused. "And other things that come later if both people decide they want them." He was aware that his heart was doing something embarrassingly theatrical. He breathed through it. "I should tell you," he said carefully, "that I have very little to offer in return. I own a lute and a coat and a collection of songs, most of which belong technically to the people I learned them from. I have no land, no house, no fortune. I make a living on the road and I'm good at it, but I'm not a man who can offer much in the practical sense." He looked at his hands on the lute. "I'm aware that you could choose anyone." She looked back at him. "Yes," she said, "I could." "Then why?" "Because you threw yourself in front of a crowd with a rope and a warrant," she said, with the simple directness of someone stating a fact. "Because you have never looked at me with fear or pity or the need to prove something. Because you make me laugh, and I have not laughed for a long time." A pause, softer. "Because when I said you were interesting, you asked what it meant instead of either flinching or preening. That was—" She stopped, started again. "That told me something." He turned toward her on the wall, and they were very close now, and the night was around them like a private room. "What did it tell you?" he asked. "That you were genuinely listening," she said. "Not performing listening, actually hearing me." He looked at her, the strong, beautiful angles of her face, the amber eyes that were watching him with the particular quality of attention that he now understood was not common from her and was therefore extraordinary, and said, very quietly, "I'm listening now." She leaned forward and kissed him. It was not tentative. Ursa Ironblood did not do tentative. It was careful, deliberate. The way she did everything, with complete intention, and it tasted of the wine they'd had at dinner and the autumn night and something that was simply hers. He kissed her back, and his hand came up to her face without planning to, and she made a sound very low in her throat that was not quite a word. When she pulled back, her forehead rested against his for a moment. He could feel her breathing. "I have not done that," she said quietly, "in a very long time either." "Did you want to do it for long?" he asked. A pause. "Since the fire," she said. "Since you told me you decided I was interesting." "Since before that," she said. "Since you called Vane's wife lucky." He laughed, surprised out of it, helplessly, and she pulled back far enough to look at him, and she was smiling. Fully, properly, the whole thing without reservation, and it was one of the most spectacular things he had ever seen in his life. He kissed her again, because it seemed the only reasonable response. They left Millhaven on the third morning in weather that had turned cold and iron-gray, the sky low and pressing, the road north going up into the proper hills where the trees thinned and the wind had room to move. Ursa walked on his left again, but now and then her hand would find his briefly. Warm, grip and release. The way you check on something you want to make sure is still there. He told her things he had not told anyone in a long time. Not dramatically, Not all at once, not in confession, but in the natural way of two people who are traveling together and have decided to give each other the real version. He told her about his parents, who had died of the fever when he was 14, and the 2 years after that when he had lived by his wits at various wharfs and market squares, playing for coins, learning to read the difference between an audience and a crowd. He told her about the fisherman Kel, his name was, Kel with the mended net and the voice like a foghorn, who had taken him in not out of charity but out of loneliness, and who had taught him the old coast songs, and who had been the first person he'd trusted since he was a child. She listened without interruption, and when he was done she said, "He sounds like a good man." He was, Tobias said. He was also infuriating. He had no patience for wrong notes. "Good," she said firmly. "Neither do I," he laughed. She looked pleased with herself. She told him in return about her mother, the war boss Cora Ironblood, who had gone to the treaty table not because she was weak, but because she was tired of counting the young men who didn't come back from border skirmishes, and who had built the Ironblood clan's trade relations with two human kingdoms almost by force of personality. She told it carefully, looking at the road ahead, and he understood that this was a story she did not tell often, not because she was ashamed of it, but because it mattered too much to give to people who wouldn't understand it. "She sounds formidable," he said. "She was," Ursa said. She started again. "She would have liked your ballads. She respected people who could make others feel things with words." A pause. "She would have said you were strange also." "Strange," he said. "Is that good?" "From her, yes," Ursa said. "She used it for people who surprised her. It was a compliment." He took her hand briefly in the way she had done to him. She didn't pull away. The road north through Fenmark Crossing was as tight as Sergeant Hadley had warned. A stone bridge over a gorge, with steep hillside on either side and a cluster of old buildings at the near end that had started as a toll post and become a small permanent settlement. There was one road in and one road out, and if someone wanted to close the crossing, they could do it with 5 men. Vane had 7. They saw the checkpoint before it saw them, or rather, Ursa saw it, pulling Tobias off the road and into the trees 60 yards back with a hand on his arm and a single quiet gesture. From the tree line they watched. The 7 men were not official, though they were wearing something that from a distance looked like Warden's colors. They were stopping travelers, every traveler, and checking faces, looking for 2 specific faces. "We could go around," Tobias said very quietly. "There's a higher trail. I saw it marked on the Postrider's map at the inn." "The higher trail is 3 days," Ursa said. "It's already cold. If the weather breaks it will be impassable. So we go through them." "Yes." She was studying the checkpoint with the concentration of someone solving an engineering problem. 7 men. 2 of them are actually paying attention. The other 5 are cold and bored. She paused. The bridge itself is narrow, 2 men abreast at most. If they move to confront, they'll funnel through the bottleneck. That's to our advantage. And if they have crossbows, 2 of them do. Those are the 2 paying attention. She was quiet. "I can reach one before he loads. The second one is your problem." Tobias looked at the man with the crossbow on the far side. He had a long shot and he was standing slightly elevated behind a wall. "My problem," Tobias said. "You said you could distract people with your voice." "I said I could distract 1 man with my voice, not 1 man with a loaded crossbow at 20 yards. Same principle." He looked at the crossbowman. He thought about angle, distance, voice projection. He thought about the kind of distraction that makes a man look away for exactly 3 seconds. He thought about his mother, who had always told him he was too clever to be afraid of his own ideas. "All right," he said. "Tell me when you're in position." What happened at Fenmark Crossing took approximately 4 minutes and 40 seconds, though it felt considerably longer from the inside. Ursa moved through the trees along the bank below the bridge road, while Tobias walked out of the tree line and onto the road as if he had simply stepped aside for a moment and was now rejoining it. He walked up to the checkpoint at a steady, unhurried pace, his lute over his shoulder, looking like a man who has nothing to hide and is slightly irritated by the delay. The 5 bored men stopped him. One of them grabbed his arm. One of them was beginning to raise his voice when Tobias looked past him at the two attentive men and the crossbowman on the wall and said, loudly and with perfect clarity, "Vane won't like this." The crossbowman turned to look at him. That was 3 seconds. Ursa came over the wall behind him so fast that the man was still turning when she was there, and the crossbow was on the ground, and Ursa's hand was on the man's collar. Not striking him, simply holding him still, which was enough. On the bridge side, the second attentive man had his own crossbow halfway up, but Tobias had the arm of the man who'd grabbed him twisted behind his back. It was more desperation than technique, but it worked, and was using him as a shield while he said, still with extraordinary calm, "You're holding a civilian, friend. That's going to be an interesting conversation with the regional authority." The standoff lasted 11 seconds. Then the second crossbowman lowered his weapon, and the other 5 men, finding themselves without the authority of the 2 men who'd been holding the situation together, began to back toward the bridge. Ursa and Tobias were across and into the northern hills in 7 minutes. They stopped half a mile from the crossing when the road curved behind a stand of pine, and they were, definitively, invisible from below. Tobias sat down on a rock because his legs had finally given him the bill for the last 4 minutes. He put his head in his hands and breathed for a moment. When he looked up, Ursa was standing over him, looking at him with an expression that he was learning to read, the one that meant she was feeling something she hadn't fully classified yet. "You held a man as a shield," she said. "I grabbed his arm," Tobias said. "He was bigger than me. It was improvised." "You looked entirely calm." "I was absolutely not calm." He held up his hands. They were shaking. "This is what calm looks like on the inside." She looked at his hands. Then she took them, both of them, between hers, big, warm, steady, and held them. "Thank you," she said. "Same as always," he said. "We're even, right?" She huffed, the sound she made instead of laughing outright when she was caught off guard by something fond. "We are never going to be even," she said, "because I am going to keep owing you things and you are going to keep telling me we are even. Is that a problem?" She looked at him, his hand still in hers. "No," she said. "It is a very strange thing, but no." She pulled him gently upright and they walked on, her shoulder against his, into the northern hills. The last stretch of road to Brecken's Ford was 4 days through country that was simultaneously harder and more beautiful than anything they'd traveled, deep forest and high ridge, streams running cold and clear over black rock, the occasional farmstead built low against the hillside as if it were trying to hold on. They camped every night, and the camps had a different quality now, easier, closer, the fire between them less of a barrier and more of a gathering point. On the 3rd night out of Fenmark, with rain coming in off the north and both of them tucked under the overhang of a limestone shelf with the fire built just inside the drip line, Ursa reached into the inner pocket of her cloak and brought out something small. She set it on the flat rock between them. It was a piece of worked iron, a pin or a clasp, roughly shaped like a bear's paw, smaller than the brooch on her cloak. Simple, clearly made by hand. "My mother's craft," she said. "She made these herself for people." She a pause, and she chose the word deliberately, claimed. He looked at it, then at her. "It's not a ceremony," she said. "We are not our clan, and I wouldn't perform a ceremony without your consent. She looked at the iron piece. "It's a making, something made by hand and given. In my family's tradition, you give it when you have decided." She met his eyes. "I decided some time ago, but I wanted to wait until I was certain you understood what it meant." "Tell me," he said softly, "so I'm certain." She held his gaze. "It means I am claiming you," she said, with the simplicity of absolute clarity. "It means you are mine, and I am yours, and I am not interested in any other arrangement." She paused. "It means that if you want, you wear this, and anyone in my culture who sees it will know that you are under my protection and my regard. And it means," a smaller pause, "that I want the same from you, in whatever form you can offer it." He picked up the iron pin. It was warm from her pocket. It was beautifully made, simple but precise, every line deliberate. "Yes," he said. He didn't need to think about it. He had not needed to think about it since the garden in Millhaven, and possibly since the fire in the hollow between the beeches, and possibly, if he was honest, since a knife had hit a table between his fingers and a woman's voice had said, "Let him go," with the calmness of absolute authority. "Yes," he said again, because it deserved to be said twice. She pinned it to the inside of his coat, her fingers careful at his lapel, and when she was done she kept her hand flat against his chest for a moment, feeling his heartbeat. He covered her hand with his. She looked up at him, and he kissed her in the rain light with the fire warm at their side, and her other hand came up to his jaw and held him as if she was making very sure of something. Later, much later, with the rain soft on the limestone above and the fire reduced to embers, she leaned against him and he leaned back against the rock, and they fit together with the complete ease of two people who have figured out the shape of the space between them. She said, very quietly, "My clan name is Stonekeep." He absorbed this. "Ursa Stonekeep Ironblood," he said. "Yes," a pause, "that is for very few people." "I'll keep it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I gave it to you." Brecken's Ford was everything the autumn trading fair promised. A walled market town full to bursting with every kind of merchant, traveler, performer, and schemer on the continent. The streets running with lantern light even in the gray autumn afternoons. The great market hall booming with the noise of 300 people eating and doing business simultaneously. The air smelled of livestock and spice and wood smoke and money changing hands. Tobias had played the fair twice before, but the head of the hall committee, a broad, cheerful man named Pell who smelled of pipe tobacco and old wine, greeted him at the door of the hall on the first evening with the enthusiasm of someone who has been hoping for a particular person to show up. "Morgan," Pell said, "thank the roads. We've got a space in the main hall, evening sessions, 6 nights. Standard rate plus a bed in the performers' quarters." "I'll need 2 beds," Tobias said. "My companion is with me." Pell looked past Tobias at Ursa, standing slightly behind and to his left. His cheerful expression did an extremely brief and professional recalibration, not disapproval, but the rapid social calculation of a man in the hospitality trade who handles complications for a living. "2 beds," he said, as if the detail were completely ordinary. "Naturally. Welcome to Brecken's Ford." Ursa inclined her head, and that was that. She found work herself within the first 2 days. There was always work for a capable fighter in a town full of merchants with goods to protect, and the trading fair had a system of hired protection for merchant caravans that needed escorts. She came back on the second evening with a contract for 3 days escort work that paid better than Tobias made in a week of performing, and she told him this with the kind of satisfaction that is not about the money, but about being useful in the way you are specifically designed to be. He told her he was deeply impressed and that she was completely terrifying. She told him that was the correct response. He played the main hall on all 6 evenings, and each night he played slightly better than the night before, because she was at the bar each time, listening with that particular quality of attention that made him want to reach further into the music than he thought he could. He added new songs, things he'd been collecting on the road, the orc woman from the harbor town that Ursa had mentioned, a melody he'd been building since the night on the garden wall, and on the 4th night, without announcing it, he played the song that had been growing since the fire in the hollow, the one with no name. It was finished now, and it was the best thing he had ever written, and when it ended the main hall was quiet in the way that means something landed. He looked at the bar, and she was there, and her expression was the one that meant she had not planned to feel as much as she was feeling. He went to her after and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and she put her hand against the place on his coat where the iron pin was and left it there for a moment. On the 5th day of the fair, Aldrich Vane arrived. Tobias saw him from across the market square in the afternoon, walking with 6 men, too many to be casual company, exactly the right number for a statement of intent. Vane had put on a better coat since the Crossroads Inn, and his face had the specific tight quality of a man who has been frustrated for long enough that he has stopped being patient about it. Tobias went to find Ursa. She was finishing the second of her escort days at the west gate of the market, watching a spice merchant's wagons complete their offloading. When Tobias appeared at her elbow and told her quietly about Vane, her expression did not change. "How many men?" she asked. "6 with him, could be more in town." "Sergeant Hadley's inquiry," she said. "Vane knows it's coming. He's running out of time to settle his debts before the king's authority closes around him." She looked at the market gate. "He's here for us. He needs to put us down before we can testify further." "That's what I thought," Tobias said. "Should we go to the garrison?" She considered this. "The garrison here is fair," she said. "But Vane has people. If we go to the garrison and Vane's already positioned men inside the gate, we could be blocked before we reach it." She looked at him steadily. "Tell me what you know about this market, every exit, every crowd bottleneck." He told her quickly and precisely because he had spent 2 days walking every inch of the fair in the eternal bard's habit of knowing the landscape. She listened without interrupting, building the picture. "The main hall," she said. "Tonight, your performance. How many people?" 300 easily. Vane will want a quiet moment. He won't move in front of 300 witnesses." She was quiet for a moment. "So we give him the quiet moment he wants, somewhere we control. You want to let him come to us?" "I want to choose the ground," she said. "Yes." The thing they arranged in the next 2 hours was not elegant. It was practical, fast, and relied heavily on Pell the hall manager having a lower tolerance for Aldrich Vane's activities than for the disruption of his trading fair. When Tobias explained the situation to Pell in the hall manager's small office, Pell listened with the expression of a man who has been managing the politics of a major fair for 20 years and has therefore seen this particular species of problem before. "Vane," Pell said flatly. "He tried to shake down 3 of my Eastern merchants last year. I've been waiting for an opportunity." He looked at Tobias. "What do you need?" "The room behind the stage," Tobias said, "and your fastest runner to the garrison post." Pell gave both without hesitation. What happened that evening, an hour before Tobias's 6th performance in the wide back courtyard of the Brecken's Ford main hall, was this. Vane came through the service gate with 4 of his men, because Tobias had made sure the information reached him through a deliberately loud conversation near the East Market stall, that the bard and his orc companion were settling a dispute in the hall's back courtyard before the evening show. Vane came with 4 men, and the confidence of someone who has been told the coast is clear, and he walked through the service gate into the courtyard and found 2 things simultaneously. The first was Tobias Morgan, standing in the center of the yard with his coat straight and his hands visible and no particular expression. The second was Ursa Ironblood, who had positioned herself not in front of Vane but behind him, between him and the gate, which meant that he turned to look at her, and his men did not know which direction to look. And the third thing, which became apparent about 10 seconds later, was that Sergeant Hadley of the Regional Compact Authority had arrived in Brecken's Ford that morning, called ahead by the message Pell's runner had sent, and was currently walking through the service gate behind Ursa with 4 of her wardens. Vane went still. Hadley walked past Ursa and stopped in front of Vane. She said, with the tired authority of someone who has been chasing paperwork for a month, "Aldrich Vane, you are under warrant of inquiry for blood price conspiracy, extortion on the King's Road, and abuse of compact law. You will come with me now, or this will become significantly more complicated for you." Vane looked at his men. His men looked at Ursa. Ursa looked at Vane with the particular expression she had that was not threatening and did not need to be. Vane said very quietly, "This is not over." "It is," Tobias said from where he was standing in the center of the yard. "You're done. You know you're done. The inquiry in the capital has your ledgers. Hadley told us last week." He tilted his head. "It was a good ballad while it lasted, but the faithless wife never wins in the second act." Vane stared at him for a moment. Then, with the defeated fury of a man who has lost on the terms he chose, he turned and went with Hadley's wardens. His 4 men, left in the courtyard with Ursa between them and the gate, made the sensible decision and raised their hands. It was over in 4 minutes. The courtyard went quiet except for the sound of footsteps leaving and the distant beginning of evening noise of the market, and Tobias stood in the center of it and felt his legs decide they had done enough today and would like to sit down. He sat down on the courtyard wall. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands and breathed. He heard Ursa cross the courtyard. He felt her sit next to him close, her warmth immediate against his side. "You're breathing very hard," she said. "Yes," he said into his hands. "Are you going to need a moment?" "Yes," he said. She put her arm around him, not a battlefield arm, not steadying or protective, though both of those were in it, but the arm of someone who knows you have just done something that cost you and is not interested in either rushing past it or making a scene of it. She simply held him. He dropped his hands and looked up at the darkening sky above the courtyard. A star had appeared, the first one. He could hear the main hall beginning to fill on the other side of the wall. "I have to play in 40 minutes, he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to play that song again," he said, "the one from the fire." "Good," she said. He turned his head and looked at her profile, the strong jaw, the elegant tusks, the amber eyes looking up at the same star. "Ursa," he said. She turned. "I want you to know," he said, "that what you offered me in the hills, what you gave me, I don't take it lightly. I don't." He stopped, organizing it. "I am not a man who has been claimed before. I'm not sure I understood before you what that would feel like. To have someone." He felt the words trying to escape him and held them long enough to get them right. "To have someone like you choose me, specifically, deliberately. Not because there was no one else or because I was convenient, but because you looked at me and decided." She was watching him very still. "It is the greatest thing anyone has ever done for me," he said quietly. "And I intend to spend as long as you'll allow me making sure you never regret it." She looked at him for a moment with the kind of directness that was, from her, more intimate than anything else could be. The full, unguarded, unperforming look of someone letting themselves be entirely seen. Then she raised her hand to his jaw, very gently, and tilted his face and bit him. He stilled in pure surprise. Not hard, it was deliberate, the edge of her tusk against the curve of his neck and shoulder held for a breath, a claiming made in the old way. He felt it as heat, as a mark, as something permanent. When she drew back, her eyes were very dark. "That is the orc way of answering," she said. "In case you were wondering." He laughed. It came out rough and a little shaky, but real. "I was wondering," he said. She traced a thumb briefly over the mark she'd left. "You are mine, Tobias Morgan," she said. "And I am yours, and anyone who sees that mark will know it. Anyone who sees it will ask what happened," he said. "And you'll tell them," she said, with the satisfaction of absolute certainty. He kissed her, in the courtyard with the star overhead and the fair noise rising on the other side of the wall, and she kissed him back without any hesitation or calculation or guard, only warmth and intention. He played the sixth performance that night, and he played it brilliantly, the way you play when everything that was tight in you has loosened, and the music can go where it wants without running into walls. 300 people in the main hall heard, among other things, the coast song from his fisherman teacher and the ballad about the river merchant's faithless wife, which got its first proper audience reaction, which was very gratifying, and the song from the fire, which he played last, and the main hall went quiet in that particular way again. Ursa was at the bar. She was always at the bar, her back to the bottles, her amber eyes on him. She was not performing enjoyment. She was simply there, attending to him, giving him the full weight of her attention as if there were nothing else in the room worth her time. He played for the hall and he played for her, and the distance between those two things was not as large as it might have been. When it was done and the room was lifting back into noise and he was coming down from the stage with his lute over his shoulder, she met him halfway. She put a cup of the inn's better wine in his hand. He drank. She watched him with the expression that was hers, not smiling, not laughing, not performing anything, just present and warm and certain. "That was the best I've ever heard you play," she said. "You've known me for 2 weeks," he said. "I know what I heard," she said. He looked at her. He thought about everything. The knife between his fingers, the fire in the hollow, her voice saying she had decided he was interesting. the iron pin against his chest, the mark she'd left on his neck that was still warm. He thought about how he had lived for 12 years in the condition of moving through other people's moments, witnessing and recording and turning experience into art, and had told himself that was enough, that it was the right life for a man who owned nothing. He thought about how completely wrong he had been. "I played better," he said, "because I was playing it for someone." She looked at him steadily. Then she said with a small and genuine smile, "You were always playing it for someone, you just did not know who yet." He raised his cup to her. She raised hers. They drank. In the morning the fair was winding down, the last wagons loading, the merchants tallying their gains, the hall committee doing the quiet arithmetic of success. Tobias was settling his accounts with Pell when Hadley found them at the hall entrance, her 4 wardens behind her, and the fresh look of someone who has completed a task they'd been working on for too long. "Vane is in custody," she said. "His men have been scattered. The inquiry will proceed from the capital. You'll both be called as witnesses, but it should not require your physical presence. Sworn statements will be accepted." She looked at them both with the frank, slightly calculating look of someone who is updating a file in her head. "You're free to go where you choose." "Thank you," Ursa said. "Thank you," Tobias added, "both for yesterday and for Millhaven." Hadley looked at him with the expression he'd seen before, the one that said she was deciding whether he was as reckless as he seemed or as calculated as he seemed to be the other half of the time. "That thing you said," she said, "in Millhaven, about Article 11, he said, "you made that up." "I cited it with complete confidence," he said. She shook her head, something that might have been reluctant respect crossing her face. "I'm not going to officially acknowledge that worked," she said, but she turned and walked away and her wardens followed her. Tobias looked at Ursa. Ursa was watching Hadley go with one corner of her mouth turned up. "She liked you," Ursa said. "She thought I was reckless," he said. "Yes," Ursa said. "That is how she liked you." He bumped her shoulder with his. She bumped back harder, and he had to take a step to keep his balance. They walked out of Brecken's Ford that afternoon, into the crisp northern air with the autumn sun going hard and gold through the stripped trees. The fair was behind them, the road ahead was open, and Tobias had money in his pocket and his loot on his back and an iron pin inside his coat. Ursa walked beside him, not ahead, not behind, exactly beside, with her axe at her hip and her cloak pinned with the bearpaw brooch and her amber eyes on the road ahead. They had talked the night before about what came next. It was the kind of conversation that contains the word next, which is a different kind of word from what comes after. Next implies choice, intention, direction. They had talked about a town Tobias knew on the eastern coast, a large port with a great music hall that paid well and year-round, and about the orc settlements north of the port where Ursa had traded contacts from her years on the road. They had talked about what it would mean to move towards something rather than away from it. They had not made everything certain, because some things take time to be certain, and they were both people who understood the value of earned things over rushed ones. But they had made enough certain, that they were going the same direction, that the direction was chosen, and that neither of them was going anywhere without the other. The road curved ahead of them through a stand of birch going yellow, and the sky above the birch was a deep, clear northern blue, and somewhere in the distance a river was running over rocks and making the sound that rivers make when they are in a hurry. "That song," Ursa said, after they had been walking for a while. "Which one?" "The one from the fire," she said. "What is it called?" He thought about it. He had not named it yet, had been carrying it nameless, waiting for the right word to arrive the way right words always did in their own time and not before. "Worth attending to," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes," she said, "that is correct." He laughed, and she made the sound that was her laugh, low and sudden and slightly reluctant and completely genuine. And they walked on together into the afternoon, the road opening ahead of them, the music already there, already building, already something worth keeping. Somewhere in the debris of Vane's dismantled plans, somewhere in the warden's custody records and the capital inquiry's ledgers, and the formal statement of 2 witnesses on the King's North Road. There was a note that said Aldrich Vane had attempted to put a knife in a bard and an orc woman, and the orc woman had put the knife in the table instead, and everything that followed had been the consequence of that. Tobias thought privately that it was the best version of how things could go. You bait a villain with an excellent line about his wife, and a woman with amber eyes and an axe decides you are interesting, and you ask what that means, and then you find out, slowly and completely and with considerable adventure in between, that what it means is this: chosen, particular, specific, irreversible, real. He reached for her hand. She gave it to him without hesitation, warm and certain, and they walked on. The road was long, the music was good. Neither of them was alone anymore, and that, for 2 people who had been alone for a very long time in very different ways, was sufficient miracle for one lifetime. But they were not finished yet. They were, in all the ways that mattered, just beginning.